What's going on? It's Sean with the Bitcoin Bros. We had the opportunity to interview an early investor to Bitcoin, hit the wave with strategy, and is now ported into Metaplanet. Cris is dropping lots of alpha in this interview. It's a jam-packed video, so make sure you watch it to the end. Let's get to the video. What's going on, crypto crew? This is Sean coming back at you. We got a special guest today, Cris. Cris has been on the X Spaces. He's been holding it down on the MSTR and Metaplanet front. He's got a really deep temperature check on what's going on in the cryptocurrency and broad Bitcoin market. So, Cris, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
So let's just get into it. We're going to have some open dialogue just around, what's going on with Metaplanet. There's a lot of excitement there. So before we dive deeper into like the 555 plan and the latest and greatest of Metaplanet, just tell the viewers a little bit about your experience with crypto and how you got, discovered Bitcoin and got into MicroStrategy and Metaplanet.
Yeah, 2015, 2016 was deep into TradFi, just on the trading front, the investing front, and ran across Bitcoin chart when it was, floating around $1,000, 1,100, and all of a sudden went down to 900, 800, 700 on the ETF, the Winklevoss ETF denial, and we're and you're like, what in the world is this thing? What is going on here? Something's going down 20, 30%, and if you're a trader, you're wanting volatility essentially. Volatility is something that's like a magnet, and so that kind of caught my attention. Didn't really take a whole lot of time with it at that point. But then just followed it from a price perspective as it went to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and started trying to get more conviction through 2017. I'm in the 2017 crew. Started out in altcoins and trying to trade altcoins, get more Bitcoin. That whole thesis, throughout 2017, and then obviously, was able to come out on the other end of that. Fortunately, on the other side of 2017, and then Bitcoin Standard, got a hold of that. Once I read Safeteen's book, it really changed my perspective on what Bitcoin was, and it wasn't just a speculative asset. And then that Bitcoin it separated itself after the block size wars and what happened there with Bitcoin Cash and the fork wars. And he really changed that book changed my life and turned me into a Bitcoin maximalist and someone that moved on from altcoins and things like that, and just focused on stacking sats and trying to stay humble, as Matt Odell would say back in the day, and just going through there, and went through COVID and just continued to stack Bitcoin as much as I could to provide for and safe for me and my family. And Bitcoin has been a big part of my life. So it definitely was transitioning myself from a speculative trader in crypto, if you will, to Bitcoin maximalism and just keeping that on the forefront. And then that led me to MicroStrategy with trapped capital that I had in retirement accounts, IRAs, Roths, that I didn't cash out for actual cold storage Bitcoin, and became a shareholder in MicroStrategy in 2021. Is right around first buys were like $48, $50 post split adjusted, right in that range. Which I wish I was super OG like when the first announcement came out. Wish it was right in August, but it took some time. And then just held it and went from there. And then I was very deep into the GBTC discount to NAV trade for those that traded that and was part of that whole complex there in 2022 and 2023. And so that was a very interesting experience. We can dive deeper into that, but I was down the massive rabbit hole for the GBTC trade. Of course, the ETF came out, NAV closed, ETFs were released, and then that's once that happened, strategy did what it did. It decoupled. It caught my attention. Jeff and I got a shout out to Jeff and Quant Bros and Ryan for those guys for putting that content out. Kind of pulled me in. I was already a shareholder, but they really opened my eyes to all the different things they talked about, and then kind of went down the massive rabbit hole for MicroStrategy all last year, and then got overweight in MicroStrategy, and then we can go into Metaplanet too, but that led me to Metaplanet about the end of April last year, as far as my portfolio weighting, and went overweight Metaplanet, and I still own both. Own some Leaps in MicroStrategy, and then own Common and Metaplanet just for disclosures. And so that's pretty much it.
Nice. We're from the same class, 2017. A lot of people, were dipping their toes into the Bitcoin waters, and then once the bear market hit, started going down those rabbit holes. When it comes to MicroStrategy and Metaplanet, you got a lot of people that feel like they missed the boat with MicroStrategy. There's still a huge amount of upside. There's S&P inclusion that's possibly going to be happening before this year is out. And that's all dependent and indicative of what Bitcoin does, obviously. But, from a holistic and giving yourself a 5-10 year plus time frame, there's still a lot of upside with MicroStrategy. But once again, because there's been splits, human psychology and things that's happened, they feel that they, being retail investors, feel like they missed that trade. So I guess the next greatest thing that has some frenzy in the market is Metaplanet. So for someone that hasn't went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole like you have and doesn't thoroughly understand Bitcoin, but is now watched what MicroStrategies did and how they quietly 100x their company valuation over the past 5 years, and are now starting to hear about this Japanese company, Metaplanet, would you suggest somebody that doesn't have any exposure to this space, what should they, and then once again, this is not financial advice, it's just your own thoughts. Should they, look into Metaplanet first? Should they, focus on, MicroStrategy? Or should they start just with the Bitcoin thesis and try to get to that one Bitcoin? What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, probably the latter for me. And we do a lot of spaces and talk about this over the past 9 months or so, and ultimately it comes down to, I think, building your foundation on Bitcoin first is very important. Is it one Bitcoin? Is it half of one? Is it 10? That's all relative. In fiat terms, like for your life and kind of where you're at. Are you single? Do you have a spouse? Do you have kids? All those different variables are so very important. So, the foundation should be built on Bitcoin in and of itself, because then that's going to give you the potential conviction in a MicroStrategy or maybe a Metaplanet, or maybe not any. I would say these Bitcoin equities are not for everyone. And in fact, I would say it's really for the majority of people, probably shouldn't touch them at all. Unless they have trapped capital, and there's different variables with that. But if you were starting clean and you had no allocation to anything, I think you should be allocated to Bitcoin first and then get that conviction. Because if you don't have that max conviction in Bitcoin, the network, Bitcoin, the asset, Bitcoin, the apex asset of this world, and understanding how important it is for human beings to be able to store their wealth in something, and understanding that concept, that will leak over to your ability to understand MicroStrategy and Metaplanet and maybe some other smaller companies up and coming, of course, which we'll talk about. But having that foundation is important, because one thing I'll mention as a shareholder of strategy, or MicroStrategy back in the day, 2022, it went. Everybody wants to talk about MNAV. It went to 0.55 MNAV. It went down. What was it, peak to trough? 95%. So you got to have either max conviction, or you got to be an expert trader that has 20 years of experience and knows what they're doing to go in and out of positions like that with something that volatile. So to have max conviction and hold it, not only hold the asset, but then keep adding to it with your cash flow and things like that. If you don't have the conviction in Bitcoin, you're not going to have the conviction needed to hold these types of volatile assets. Because if Bitcoin's a 50 vol asset and MicroStrategy is 100, Metaplanet is 150 or 200 plus volatility. There's times where Metaplanet is 4 to 5 times as much as volatile as Bitcoin is today. So that conviction in Bitcoin is foundational for anything else if you're looking to go out on the risk curve, but it's not for everyone.
100% agree there. A good analogy would be like if you're building a home, you're not going to start building the roof first or any of the paneling. You're going to start with that foundation at the bottom, then you're going to work your way up to the roof. And basically, if you don't understand, one, what Bitcoin is, or two, the vitality or the volatility that Bitcoin puts on, not just with the underlying asset itself, but if a company supercharges like what Strategy did, why is Strategy going so asymmetric to the upside since they did this over the past 5 years? If you don't understand the volatility of Bitcoin and why that's important, and also why it's important from a global lens, you can definitely, trick yourself out of your own position if you just skip that underlying foundation that you discussed there. So 100% agree there. So let's talk about Bitcoin treasury companies. Bitcoin treasury companies, as of late, at least within the X spaces and what's going on within X or Twitter, whatever name you want to call it, it seems like there's a frenzy there, but the reality is that a lot of retail is still missing the trade. The big money is always going to find, those arb plays and these Bitcoin treasuries before they even get publicly listed. But the thing is there's a huge opportunity in the space right now with Bitcoin treasury companies. MicroStrategy paved the way. Metaplanet, I guess, it wasn't the second company that actually did this, because Simler came out shortly thereafter. Maybe some years after not Metaplanet, MicroStrategy did, or Strategy. So right now, it seems that there's a lot of eyes, at least in the Bitcoin space, looking at Metaplanet and getting very excited at what's going on with Metaplanet. And as of late, being the last 1, 2, 3 months, you're seeing these Bitcoin treasury companies pop up, sort of like the ICO craze back in 2017, when you started to see all these different altcoins pop up, getting listed on Binance or new Coinbase listings. You see a huge initial pop, and it might do a 20, 30, 40x within a few days. And then, there was also rug pulls that happened back then. Some of those companies are still around today. But with the Bitcoin treasury space, before we get into Metaplanet, are you, looking into any other treasuries that are maybe, piqued your interest, some things that they're doing?
Yeah, what I try to do is I'm trying to follow all the companies as much as I possibly can to then implement that thesis, and really challenge my thesis on Metaplanet. I look at MicroStrategy. They've distanced themselves, and they are in a completely different phase in their progression, in my opinion, than any other company. So a lot of times I like to pull them out. And look, for me, for just real quick, the TLDR for me on MicroStrategy is I think they'll be the most valuable company in the world in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
That's my long-term thesis. So I set that aside, and I'm allocated the way I want to allocate, and I put that over there, right? So I've got that. I've got my Bitcoin cold storage. I think MicroStrategy is going to be the most valuable company in the world in 10 years, within 10 years. And then I've got the other basket. And so you as an individual have to figure out how much is in each basket, so that's kind of how I look at it. And then so for me, when it clicked in late April, early May with Metaplanet, I had followed Dylan since 2020. I mean, ever since he put out that article, the long-term debt cycle, and he just showed, his mind for Bitcoin and his ability to, and especially at that point in time, like take in all the macro factors in the financial markets, and then create a thesis around Bitcoin and why Bitcoin was important. Sub 10K. Back then, it was like, man. I mean, I call him a kid, but I mean, man, this kid knows what he's doing. Like he has a mind for this, and that was 4 or 5 years ago. And so when he joined Metaplanet, I've got multiple tweets out there, and it's kind of embarrassing, but I tweeted him, I tagged him, put the Metaplanet chart out there. I think the earliest chart I put out, it was like 80 yen. And it hit 2,000 yen or whatever. I know there's been splits and stuff, but like that was in May of last year. I'm tagging them and congratulating them and things like that, because I've went back and forth with them before. And, it was really cool to just see his progression, and then for them to be the head of Bitcoin strategy on Metaplanet and then have the backers that they did, there was, good chance for success for them. And then, so that's, and we'll get into Metaplanet in a minute, but going back to just the general Bitcoin treasury space, there's going to be a lot of big winners and a lot of big losers, and there's going to be a lot of volatility. And the way I just, I try to be very blunt about it. And if you have not made a living trading or investing over a certain period of, like, a significant period of time, and then you decide that all of a sudden you're just going to start jumping on your phone and jumping in on all this stuff, and you're going to start here, I will guarantee you that you will pay your tuition, just like in this book that everybody should read if you're messing with this stuff in the short term. Reminiscences of a Stock Operator. Probably can't see it because it's glaring me out, but this is something you have to understand and have a pretty deep grasp on, just in general, of what trading is. And then we talk about spaces like identify: are you an investor or are you a trader? Because this stuff is going to be incredibly volatile. You're going to see things up 500% in one day, maybe more, depending on the liquidity. But then the next day it could be down 50% or 40%. And if you've never traded a market like that before, this is something that it will. I mean, you have no reference point what to compare it to. Also, I'm reading Howard Marks' Mastering the Market Cycle, and those type of books. Like if you've never been through a market cycle before, in TradFi, for example, or even 2017 in crypto in general, back when a lot of post maxis were were trading back then. Then you turn to a maxi after that. But if you aren't part of those things, like you don't have any reference points. So the biggest key is there's just going to be a lot. There's going to be a lot. There's new ones popping up every single day, and so this one's hot today. This one's not tomorrow, and you can even feel, and we talked about like the shifts going from one to the next, one to the next, one to the next. Oh, this is a sympathy play, and oh, this is the first in this country, and all those things. And so there's going to be a lot of narratives. There's going to be a lot of different opinions, different takes, and a lot of this is going to be happening very quickly in real time. And if you haven't navigated that before, you're going to be at a really significant disadvantage. Especially if you're full porting your entire your entire account on some of this stuff. So you just got to have bankroll management and things like that. There's a lot of variables that go into all this. If you're really focused on the smaller I would call them nano cap names with the small market caps. So it's just I would just say be careful out there. Do a ton of research, and you're gonna have to keep up with this stuff very closely day to day.
Yeah, I agree. You're seeing all these newer companies starting to pop up and announce their Bitcoin treasury strategy, and with that comes a lot of volatility to the upside. So you start to hear about, oh yeah, this company has done a 20-30x within a week's time or 2 weeks time or whatever the time frame is in the short term. But I sort of use the analogy, and we've used this on some of our previous live streams, is if you're looking out like at some boats in a harbor, and in the distance you see the real big oil tanker out there that's just sort of sitting still and chilling. And then closer you're seeing some people with yachts, and then some people with some 15-20 foot boats, people jet skiing around. And I sort of use the analogy as the big oil tanker being strategy, with the 600,000, well, not quite 600, but almost 600,000 Bitcoin, just sitting out there while some of the other boats might be cruising around. And use the analogy of some of the smaller yachts are making more gains than MicroStrategy at the moment. So like, for instance, there's been a lot of strategy shareholders that have been complaining as of late because the price action hasn't been moving as fast as some of these other Bitcoin treasury companies. Well, with those 600,000 Bitcoin they have, there's a lot of pent up energy that's just stored there. And Bitcoin's sort of been trading sideways as well. But once those propellers start to, rolling for that big oil tanker, and it starts to get some momentum, it's going to be all eyes on that, because it's going to be the biggest thing moving, and it's going to be even harder to slow it down when that happens, versus a company equivalent to a jet ski that might come out and announce we bought 50 Bitcoins here, and they're more nimble and moving very fast, and that's a quick 20-30x. So you can try to hit those arbitrage trades, but like you said, there's a lot of volatility to the upside, and those companies have a lot of volatility to the downside as well. So, investors just have to be mindful of that and understand that some of these companies aren't going to be as strategic as some of the ones that have been doing it more long term. They may get some FOMO. That's human nature. They may want to catch up to Metaplanet, or, may want to try to feel like they can catch strategy. I feel like some companies probably do have that mindset and may use leverage, potentially not rehypothecation. We'll see if that plays out again, similar to like how Celsius did a few years back and FTX. But you're going to get that FOMO at the institutional level, and what some of these companies do in the short to mid-term is very important. And managing their risk is the biggest thing that we sort of preach on our channel, because, yeah, you can make some quick money, but are you going to hold it for 10 years? Are you going to hold it for 5 years? Are they going to be around in 5 years? Are they going to be around next year? That's all these questions they have to ask themselves. So, people are starting to see these, new shiny objects and forgetting that who paved this way. And, you got to look at market cap. With 600,000 Bitcoin, strategy is really around $100 billion valuation, which in the grand scheme of things, the way the M2 money supply is ever expanding, if you look at the biggest companies today, strategy is going to surpass them at a multiple, in my opinion. Like, it's still early even for strategy. And that's what some of the newer investors get into this space, I hope they pick up. But yeah, so exciting stuff going on with treasuries. But let's focus, on Metaplanet and have some discussion around Metaplanet. They recently came out with their 555 announcement, and for those that don't know, they're going to be, getting a new acquisition of 555 million shares, taking their total share count to about 1.15 billion. And then they set some benchmarks out there. By the end of this year, they're going to be shooting for a 30,000 Bitcoin acquisition target, Bitcoin holdings in total. By the end of 2025, by the end of 2026, it's 100,000. By the end of 2027, they want to get to 1% of the Bitcoin supply, 210,000 Bitcoin. So let's just start there. From when you first discovered Metaplanet, you said you've been following Dylan for quite some time, and you've seen their growth since last year. And they just recently made a purchase today, and at the current time of this recording, they're at 11,111 Bitcoin. How do you feel about their overall strategy and what they're doing? And then do you feel like they're going to be able to accomplish their goals by the end of this year to hit that 30,000 Bitcoin threshold that they're shooting for?
Yeah, I think most recently, I was pulling this up, for information too as we kind of go along here. But the one thing I think people should go listen to is, there's a couple of interviews with Simon. So Simon and Richard Byworth is a phenomenal interview on YouTube. Also, Dylan did a Spaces a couple weeks ago that really did a, recalibration of their story and kind of got you up to date as to what's happened and then what they are projecting out, as far as what they're looking for in the future. And one of the biggest takeaways for me, I think, if you're just now getting into them and trying to just, wrap your head around what's going on here is, to me, and this hit me in like late April, early May, because I had seen them, acquire Bitcoin for a year, and they were kind of quiet in last summer and then fall because look, they had to work with regulators, or a lot of things they had to do in the Japanese market in order to set the foundation for them to do this strategy over there. And so they really were laying the groundwork for a while. But then in October and November, they had a couple of big buys come in, and of course, obviously, volatility ramped up after the election with a lot of different Bitcoin proxies and stuff. But that that's what was interesting to me. So that it took off there as far as Bitcoin purchases. But then they also got a US OTCQX listing in MTPLF, which allowed another pool of capital to get access to them in November. So that was a big thing. And I remember when they announced it, tagged Dylan, like congratulated them. But even myself, I looked at it and the spreads were really wide. The volume was not very good. Liquidity wasn't quite there. So, with an OTC listing, which there's so many of these are OTC listings right now, sometimes you just don't have the liquidity profile. And, a lot of investors, bigger stake investors that would want to come in with size, wouldn't be able to do that with some of those types of listings. And so it's kind of initially on the US side, that's kind of how it was with the OTCQX MTPLF. But that was good news. That was a good move in the right direction. But even me, just like last year, I was so ultra focused on strategy that kind of pulled away from it. And then in April, they had a couple more big buys, got them over like 2,000 Bitcoin. And then and I also found that the Capital Group had bought 5% of the company, and that was disclosed in early January 2025. And that was for the period of Q4 2024. And just real quick on the Capital Group, basically, in my opinion, Capital Group is probably one of the best institutions as far as track record of investments. over the past century. They've been in existence since the 1930s. They were established during the Great Depression. They have been early investors in Amazon, like in the early 2000s, in Nvidia in like 2015, Facebook, early I think 2013. So their track record is incredible when it comes to forward-looking, hyper growth tech companies. And when I found that out in April, because I mean Simon Garovich, the CEO of Metaplanet, they announced it in January, and it was kind of crickets. And in Metaplanet, ripped really hard in February. Their MNAV went through the roof. I think over right at 10 or 11 for those that follow MNAV. And then of course, the tariff debacle and all risk assets got crushed, right? And so you can see there on the historical MNAV went up to about 10, and they came all the way back down to 3 and below 3. And Adam Back and some of his threads going through those, and just other people's threads too. Obviously, like Klein, who I'm pretty close with, over the last 6 to 9 months, came out with his thread in April, and things are just lining up for them. And you're coming out of the post little mini financial crisis we had. I call it a little mini crisis, but after that, and a lot of times when you recover, you look at risk assets and you're saying, okay, what has the most growth opportunity? And so for me, it was they were really hitting their stride, and the market was recovering from the tariff debacle. So to me, it was just like this prime opportunity, especially with their MNAV below 3. I think it was like 2.8 or something like that when I first really started allocating at the end of April and early May. And you can see that it expanded the MNAV. If you looked at DN3, which is the German exchange, I think hit around like 20 euros. So if it basically went from $250 a share from dollar comparative to a roughly like $25. So it did a 10x in share price in I think about like in May 21st. So it's about a month, maybe 4 weeks. And so the MNAV, if you look at the MNAV went from sub 3, went from like 3 to like 15 or 16, something like that. It's not that's a chart I sent you. Doesn't have it on there, but if you just run the calculations real quick, so you can see how volatile not only the share price is, but how volatile the MNAV is as well. And Dylan talks about that volatility in that concern. So that's what really set me off in late April, early May, just putting all those things together and just building a thesis around. They've got a monopolistic hold in Japan. They had it back then, and I still think they still have it now. We can talk more about that, about their strategy, and then they're really just implementing MSTR's playbook in Japan. And they're going to be able to not only do their moving stock warrants or strike warrants, which we can talk about. I know you have a slide up there for the moving strike warrants, but they've got the ATM moving strike warrants. They have the ordinary bonds that they have the relationship with Evo, which we'll talk about in just a minute as well. And then they have the potential to do preferred offerings similar to Strike, Strife, and Stride that MSTR has issued. So I would also encourage the people just in general, if you're looking at Metaplanet, the more you understand Bitcoin, the more you understand MicroStrategy. The more you understand MicroStrategy, the more you understand Metaplanet. That is key. Because really, when Saylor did his last earnings call, which is probably one of the most important videos you can ever watch as a shareholder of any treasury companies, if you watch that last earnings call, that's the playbook they're running in Japan with slightly different nuances to it. But the basis of what they're doing is based on what MSTR has already done. And so they're in phase 3, I would like to say, with the preferred stocks and the preferred offerings with Strike, Strife, and Stride. And so Metaplanet has been very clear that's the next step in their progression. So they're following in the footsteps, and they have a monopolistic hold, in my opinion, at this point, because they already hit their inflection and they already hit escape velocity. And a lot of people, agree with me, and I think that continues. So that's when you have that monopolistic premium, or a company that's created a monopoly around them, like an Amazon or like an Nvidia, early on, and you identify it. It's kind of hard to unsee it, and it's hard to allocate to anything else when it comes to that. So when it comes to like equities,
100%. Speaking on the monopoly comment, so agree that within the Japanese market that they definitely have a monopoly, and just the way they're doing things, the way they're executing, they're doing it at lightning speed, they're being very efficient, and they're being very cognizant of the MNAV that you had mentioned earlier as well. But there's an argument where, and this was through some X spaces, I think you may have been on one actually, but of the monopoly that strategy may have on the entire space versus what the monopoly Metaplanet has in Japan. But there's a strong argument to say that because there's no, so like for instance, how Metaplanet has their MTPLF ticker in the United States and also their DN3 in the German market. There's no U.S. tickers in the Japanese space, and that hasn't happened ever in history. Will that happen with strategy? I'm not 100% certain in all the regulatory and regulation behind that, but even if it did, the sentiment of the investors in the Japanese market, are, they're primarily thinking, let's buy Japanese first and then diversify from there. So even with Metaplanet having a little over 11,000 Bitcoin versus the 600,000 that strategy has, there's a definite argument to say that they have the Japanese market, which is the third largest market globally, sort of like a monopoly, if you say.
Yeah, and like the window too. Again, if you're a hardcore Metaplanet shareholder, either you hold MicroStrategy or either you have held MicroStrategy or you have switched or whatever, but you've been a shareholder probably at some point, so you understand what's going on their end, right? So you understand, like Saylor just said, I'm coming for all the markets with his preferreds. He's like, I'm going to go to Japan, I'm going to go to Germany, I'm going to go to Europe, I'm going to Europe, he's going everywhere with his preferreds. So it sounds kind of scary, maybe, if that clip, you're like, oh no, he's coming for Japan, But I think people need to also understand the demand for this stuff is so incredible. I don't have the exact numbers on our screen right now, but I just think in general, to understand that the demand is incredible for these products, that there's room for both. I mean, for the foreseeable future. So even if they somehow magically showed up tomorrow with Strike, Strife, and Stride and was offering those things, which, by the way, that's going to take some time for that to do that. Those offerings here, in the U.S., that's taking time. But then for them to jurisdictionally be able to go, and attack those other areas, there's a lot of red tape to go through all that essentially. And, I don't see that in a short to medium term, like a threat to Metaplanet and what they're going to offer here, I would think in the next 12 months with the preferreds. So that's the thing. So, but yeah, if you want to talk about MNAV, I think that's what everybody likes to talk about. So we can kind of maybe focus on that. But like just from that chart you showed, the MNAV is something that, people can talk about the MNAV and the issue with it ever since strategy decoupled, what we like to say, back in Q1 of 24, when everybody said, oh, well, the ETFs are out, it's going to, strategy's useless. Why would you buy strategy? Why would you buy MicroStrategy? Now there's a Bitcoin ETF. And then their, MNAV went below 1. And then everybody was saying it would never trade above 1. And then, if you look at Strategy Tracker, what has happened? Ever since it decoupled and went above 1, it's never come back down to retest it again. Now, could it come back down to 1 in a bear market? We saw it at a 0.5 MNAV in 2022. I was a shareholder. A lot of you were too. Like, what I'm talking about. It happened. Can it happen again? Yeah, of course it can happen again. Do I think it's likely to go back down to 0.5? No, I do not think it's likely because of the dynamics that they've created with their preferred offerings. And if you listen to Saylor talking about, Chanos is, shorting him obviously right now. Everybody knows that. And he basically said, look, we've got these offerings now. We can use these offerings. If you drive our price below 1 MNAV, we're going to use Stride to buy our shares back, and you're going to get liquidated, is what literally he said on CNBC or Bloomberg. So he has the tools with the preferreds to defend their MNAV. And so moving with Metaplanet, that's their next step of their phase. They understand that they want these different offerings. They want these preferreds because they're going to pull different gears. And then they're going to be able to execute in any market dynamic, bull market, bear market, crab market, whatever. They're going to be able to pull those different levers in different gears. in order to, number one, accrete Bitcoin in the most efficient way, but then number two, defend their MNAV, because the other dynamic that's going to happen with this, just like strategy, you're going to have shorts coming in. And if Saylor's talking about short attacks, other companies better be prepared. He doesn't just talk about stuff just to talk about it. And just on that last interview, he's like, look, we've got these preferreds and Stride now to defend our MNAV. And that's something that's very important from a share price standpoint, and that game theory going on with that. So we'll see the MNAV. Dylan's talked about it. Simon's talked about it. The MNAV is going to be as volatile as the share price too. And then this is where, like, if you're a trader of this stuff, like day to day and week to week, first of all, good luck. Like, day to day to week is just, are you kidding me? Like, there is no system that's going to tell you to do this and that. And as someone that's been around for a really long time and paid a lot of tuition, like we like to say, because you pay tuition, that's your experience. Mm-hmm. There ain't no system that's going to tell you what to do every day of this thing. It doesn't exist. You know what I'm saying? For those that are brand new and think they exist, it doesn't exist. You know what I'm saying? So this MNAV is going to go wild. Again, it went from, just from April to June, it went from a 2.8 MNAV to like 16. And then now it's back down to 6. And it's going to be wild and all over the place. And then MNAV is only one way to value this company. And, you mentioned on some of the other spaces, people are using the MNAV as like the end all be all metric that, like, oh, the MNAV is 8. You should never touch this company. Pretty similar to, NVIDIA's PE is 110. Right. And this was in 2017. Like, NVIDIA's in PE is 110. I'll never touch it. Well, yeah, you just missed on a 40x because you just looked at 110 PE and didn't understand what the company was doing under the hood. Same thing with Amazon in 2003. Oh, the PE, it's too expensive. They don't make any money. Well, you just missed on 110x. But Bill Miller did. Bill Miller is one of the most greatest investors of all time. But they kept buying in 98, 99, 2000. He bought all the way down. And then half his net worth was Amazon because he believed it was under the hood. And I think this is very similar to Metaplanet and strategy. If you understand what's going on under the hood, an MNAV of 8 or an MNAV of 2 compared to 10 years from now, if you believe they have that kind of runway, it really doesn't matter. It's more like a trading metric and things like that when it comes to trying to jump in and out of volatility. So didn't mean to go that long with it. But.
No, it's fine. I think this is a good conversation because there's people that are just discovering this and going down your own rabbit hole. Understand that just because this chart that we're showing here, the MNAV is oscillated between 3 and 20. Even if it goes back up to 15 to 20, like, understand that this thing can expand even farther than what that all-time high is now. This is still extremely early on, and this is only one metric. I would say this is not financial advice. Don't even pay attention to it because it's still so early on. If this thing spikes up to 30 MNAV by next month, which, it's probably not going to do that, but it's not out there on possibility with, certain situations playing out in certain ways. But my point is like, just don't say, oh, the MNAV's too high, because you actually have some companies that's been around that are publicly listed and their MNAVs are over 50. So just put that in perspective, guys. So let's pivot from the MNAV conversation and let's actually talk about their 5-5-5 plan. Just to set the tone, what's the purpose of this plan? Basically, the overall thesis and thought process is to transform Metaplanet into Asia's strategy or microstrategy. It's modeled off of strategy. That's what a lot of these companies are doing, just following the strategy playbook, but they're tweaking it and putting their own little flavor to it. Metaplanet seeks to be, the Bitcoin vehicle for investors in Asia and also globally. But right now they're starting, in the Japanese markets. They're focusing a lot on maximizing shareholder value by growing its Bitcoin per share. So, as this, Metaplanet's been, getting on a lot of people's radars over the past few months, people are saying, well, should I wait? It might come back down to $5 or $7 per share. And, I don't even really look at the price in US dollar value because, I've understood to change the denominator. The denominator needs to be changed to Bitcoin. And if you look at their Bitcoin per share ratio, they are, I believe, doubling their Bitcoin per share.
I think
Every 90.
I think you're right. It's like 90 days, but then they're doubling their Bitcoin stack every 62 days, roughly. And
Yeah,
then, like you said, every 90. Mhm.
right. But what this company is doing, they hope to deliver an exponential shareholder returns as Bitcoin appreciates. So if Bitcoin falls, don't think that Metaplanet is going to just crumble. The share price might fall. We've seen a pullback as of late with war fears, and the price held pretty steady. I mean, I think the close was around Friday in the U.S. markets was around $2.25 to $12.25 to $12.30, and opening at the current time this recording I think was around 11, and the price right now is 11.21. So even with Bitcoin having a somewhat of a pullback, the price held pretty strong. But even if it does pull back below 10 because of a fear of the market or Bitcoin cooling off for a little bit, the point is just having that long term lens because they're going to keep buying Bitcoin, and it's even better for the company because they get cheaper Bitcoin and they can keep doing this flywheel even faster. So leveraging and expanding the market cap as Bitcoin holdings grow, Metaplanet anticipates the market cap growth that could follow or exceed the given MNAV multiples that we've seen of late, or of that of what strategy has been historically trading at around between 1.5 and 3 MNAV. So is there anything that you want to talk about with the 555 plan, your thoughts on it? You think that they're going to be able to execute this with expert precision and hit their benchmarks by year end and by end of 2027?
Yeah, the big picture of it, again, the spaces that Dylan did a couple weeks ago, I'm sure you guys will probably put that link in the show notes for everybody in the comments to check it out. Dylan walks through all of this. And I mean, I had a couple takeaways that are big picture. You can listen to the spaces yourself. But, he said that they're moving into the exponential phase. He said moving into. They're not even in the exponential phase. So in the end, you know how it is. Like, do you believe the company's directors when they say they're doing something? And this is what it comes down to, period. Like they say they're going to get 30,000 by the end of the year, 30,000 Bitcoin. And throughout the spaces and all the different models, things like that, they are underselling what they're doing. They want to undersell, they don't want to overpromise. They do not want to do that. They want to set a benchmark that they will hit, that they're very confident in that they're going to exceed. And he has said that in a way of, without saying it, he's saying we're hitting our exponential phase and we're confident in the numbers that we're putting out. And he said that maybe not the exact same word, but they're sandbagging some of the numbers, because they're ratcheting down the variables because they want to be able to set expectations correctly for the market. And they had to revise up. That's the other thing. They had a 21 plan, and then so now it's going to 30,000. He said they changed it because they were moving so fast. They had to revise up. Like any tech company, if you're an investor in a tech company that said, "Hey, we're going to increase our earnings by 50% more than what we thought," you know what the market does with those companies? It goes ballistic. The markets go ballistic over stuff like that, but the market doesn't understand what they're doing. Right. Because how do you understand what Metaplanet's doing if you don't understand what strategy is doing? And then if you don't understand what strategy is doing, it's because you don't understand what Bitcoin is. So the market's having a problem valuing the company's operation, and then number two, valuing the future value of Bitcoin. So a lot of times, like for me, and so they're saying if you go even farther out, let's say at the end of 2027, they say that they're going to be at 210,000 Bitcoin. And if you think Bitcoin's going to be $1 million a coin, and they have 200,000 Bitcoin in 2030, do the math on it.
Exactly.
And then you take it backwards. Like, okay, well, do I really believe they're going to get to 200? I mean, by 2030, they might have 300,000 Bitcoin or 400,000 Bitcoin. And if Bitcoin's $1 million a coin, then you just run the quick math. What's the market cap of that? You're talking, hundreds of billions, so or plus. So that's something to think about. And it's, they say they're going to get to 30,000 by the end of this year. And if you depending on the projections, because it depends on the velocity of the flywheel, right? And then he puts out different expectations and kind of brackets of where they could be from top to bottom. And there's some of these models that you can run because the velocity it's exponential growth, so we have a hard time calculating what could happen. But there's definitely models where they could get to 100,000 Bitcoin in 6 months. 6-7 months, but by January they could have almost 100,000 Bitcoin.
I think with this tweet here, I think that's sort of leading into that $100,000 Bitcoin between the dates of 12/21 of this year and January 20th of 2026.
And by the way, Hiyoko is he's an amazing follow. He's a Japanese analyst and a shareholder for a long time, and he's probably one of my top 5 follows for Metaplanet discussion.
So definitely show some love to Hiyoko, and let's just talk about this here.
Yeah.
Talking about Metaplanet's monthly Bitcoin purchase forecast. Let's compare with future data and check whether each milestone is achievable. So he made this calculation as of yesterday, and the monthly Bitcoin purchases and cumulative holdings starting at T equals 442 with April 8th, a little over a year ago, equaling 0. So as T increases, that's, I'm pretty sure, each day. So he has these T ranges over these given dates and potentially what Metaplanet could be buying for this given time frame and their total Bitcoin. And this shows you exactly, if the if the what's the word I'm looking for? Barring that Bitcoin doesn't, double in 30 days or doesn't have some type of euphoric run up based off the US government, saying that they're going to acquire 1 million Bitcoin by the end of the year. Barring some event like that, and the price just does what most expect it to do. No one has a crystal ball, but this shows you how Metaplanet can step from 3,700. This is roughly a month picture. So each one of these lines shows 1 month, 2 month through month 7. And it shows you how much Bitcoin they can accumulate based off of their given strategy. And by January 20th, there's definitely an argument to where they can get close to 100,000 Bitcoin at 94,000. So if you're seeing this in the short term, because 7 months in an long-term investment thesis is not a long time. So if you're seeing a company that's going to roughly almost 5x that's almost a 10x. Let's just say 9x to be conservative, but 9x their Bitcoin share over the next 7 months. What's that going to do for the underlying stock price for the common A holder? And then if there's a huge frenzy while they're doing this and Bitcoin goes to 200,000 or 300,000 or even 150,000, do the math on it. Just take the price of Bitcoin and multiply it by their stack. You can see how much the value Bitcoin the company owns, and that's going to trade at a premium. And then you can go back to the MNAV conversation that we just had, and you can sort of guesstimate what that premium might be. So you can see how we are still extremely early on. I didn't know what your thoughts were on this, Chris.
I'll give you basic math. I'm just kind of pulling numbers, but let's just, for numbers' sake, let's say January 1st, Bitcoin's at 200,000 and they have 100,000 Bitcoin. Okay, their net asset value would be $20 billion. Now, just put a 2x MNAV on it. That's $40 billion. Okay, that's $40 billion. And their market cap right now is it's right at $7 billion. So that's a 5.5x. Now, I know people are going to scream and yell. I understand share dilution. There's other stuff involved with that. But that's imputing only a 200,000 Bitcoin price, them only having 100, which by the way, it could be more. We really don't know. I'm not saying they're going to get 100, but there's a probability curve. It could be more. But just a $200,000 Bitcoin, 100,000 Bitcoin in their stack, and a 2x MNAV is a $40 billion market cap, and we're sitting at 7 billion right now. And you can argue, and see, this is where if you change, like, these inputs can be so different. It could be, and that's what's so difficult at projecting. But if we're in a Bitcoin mania, if we're in a 2017 blow off mania, and you lived through it, Sean, I did, and a lot of other people did. This is not 2017 mania. It ain't even close, and we all know that. If we live through that, where do you think where do you think the MNAV is going to be? You think MNAV is going to be 2?
No.
In a blow off mania? If you've been through these cycles, I don't know. It could be 8. It could touch 10 again. It just hit 15 4 weeks ago. So I'm imputing only a 2x MNAV. But if you did a 4x MNAV, then the market cap's 80 billion. And if it's a 5x MNAV, it's 100 billion. Now, I'm not saying it's going there. This is not what I'm saying. And this is like you've said before. This is all probability, and this is just as you. And maybe this is more on the trading aspect too. But in the more shorter term, you're looking at these different scenarios, and then you have to put your own calculation of what's the scenario, what's the chance that they get to 100,000 Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's at 200,000, and then the market gives it a 5x MNAV to get to $100 billion market cap. You know what I'm saying? And then you allocate accordingly or whatever. But yeah, when you start running the numbers, in a very basic form and fashion, that's when you start waking. That's what woke me up. Is once I was like, wow, their velocity of how quickly they're accumulating is changing, and it's not only changing, but the market's not reacting to it. Is how I'm looking at it, because that's what Dylan basically what he's saying, and what he's saying is that we're growing exponentially, but the market's not figuring it out yet. He doesn't say it that way, but that's how I take how he's saying things. And so like with NVIDIA or Tesla or any super hyper growth bleeding edge company, you've been through it before. Like, you felt it and seen it. And so this is a very similar situation, in my opinion, especially because you're having to deal with Bitcoin as an exponential technology.
So in that scenario that you just laid out, and 1,000% agree, we're looking at a 6 to 7 month window in this general conversation that Cris and I are talking about right now. So expand your time horizon for 5 years, and then 10, and they have goals of hitting 1% of. They, being Metaplanet, have goals of hitting 1% of the overall Bitcoin supply by the end of 2027. Every goal and benchmark that they've set out, they've overperformed. They've overdelivered. So don't be surprised if it's substantially higher by that given time frame. But then when your time horizon is on a 5-year window past 2027, and you're talking about Bitcoin being at 1.5 million, 2, 3, 4, 5 million, whenever that time frame happens. That could happen by 2030. There's some projections out there, such as Kathy Wood and others, that think that's going to happen. Some think it's going to happen in 2032. Point is, and within the next decade, it's most likely going to happen. So when Bitcoin's $1 million, if it happens in 2035, how many Bitcoin can Metaplanet own within a given 10-year window? And then do that multiple, how many ever Bitcoin you think they're on, multiply that by 1 million, and then give it a minimum of 2 MNAV, like Cris just did. And basically, you'll see how asymmetric that this trade could go to the upside. And that's what, people are really, really sleeping on right now. And once again, you have to, in order to understand Metaplanet, you have to understand strategy. And in order to understand strategy, you have to understand Bitcoin at a granular level to understand where this flywheel really could go. It's going to go up forever, because Bitcoin's going to go up forever. Bitcoin has no ceiling. But yeah, man, it's a huge asymmetric upside, and it's all indicative of what Bitcoin does. And for Metaplanet's sake, they're hoping that it doesn't get too frothy as far as the Bitcoin price. They don't want to really hear an announcement of President Trump coming out and saying, okay, we're going to start buying Bitcoin, because that's going to cascade a whole different level of FOMO that we've never seen even to date. Because you're going to see FOMO at an institutional level, country level, and right now, I think in the U.S., it's either their third or fourth state has gotten their, I think it's third state has gotten their Bitcoin treasury reserve pass in Texas. So you got 3 states that's passed it this year. We had Dennis Porter on the channel about a month and a half ago. He's doing a lot of work in that space. And basically, they didn't project to get 2 this year. And they already have 3 in the first half of the year. And for those that, don't realize what's going on, everything starts at the state level when it comes to, marijuana, women's rights. Everything starts at the state level and then bubbles up federally. So you got 3 this year, and once the ball gets rolling, it's going to start rolling faster. So once over 25, 26 states, get this legislation passed, you're going to see an announcement around the corner on a federal level. And then what's that look like for companies like Metaplanet when there's FOMO on a federal level in the U.S. for Bitcoin? What could that MNAV be in that type of frenzy? We've never seen that frenzy. This is the first time in history that we're going through an asset that players in different markets are trying to acquire at fast rates. We've never seen this. And it's all the way up to a federal level down to the retail level. So the Metaplanet trade is definitely one to not sleep on. The 555 plan, as far as their overall thesis, the company's overall thesis, how fast do you think they can get through this MTPLF plan?
Yeah, just conjecturing. I mean, it's pretty wide range. But I think they can get through it in 6 to 9 months. Mm-hmm. The reason why I say that is what's going to happen is their flywheel is starting to spin faster. Okay, so and you look at how volatile the stock is. Number one, the volume of shares being traded in Japan on the TSE. I mean, they're off the charts. They're hitting the number 1 spot, almost on a weekly basis as far as number of shares and volume when it comes to that. And they're a $6 billion market cap, and they're trading more than Toyota. Toyota's like a $200 billion company, and they're trading, the activity is more. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is what happened with MicroStrategy. This is exactly what happened like a year and a half ago. And that's why people that were shareholders or still shareholders in Strategy can't unsee Metaplanet. You cannot unsee this thing because you already lived through it. Like, if you've lived through something once, you can feel it happening again. So that's what happened like 2 months ago. I really felt like this like, oh my goodness, Metaplanet's, MSTR 2023, because that's when like the volume, like like MicroStrategy's top 10 in volume. Like, what's going? Like, it traded as much as Nvidia, and like it traded as much as Amazon, and it was like not Nvidia, but Amazon. I think it traded as much as Amazon. It was like top 10. It was like a $20 billion market cap. Like, what is going on here? And this is kind of what's happening the last couple of months with Metaplanet compared to other Japanese companies. Also, the NISA account. The NISA account is basically like a Roth IRA if you're in the U.S., but for Japanese investors. And it's like a top 5 name in NISA accounts now, as far as like new money coming in. Are you kidding me? Like, what is happening here? And like, I talk to Japanese investors. I talk to them, and they've been telling me this for a while. And it's just like, when you talk, especially when you talk to someone over there living it, that's different than someone randomly posting on X. And then Dylan talking about the culture over there and how, and this is what you want. Like, either you love Metaplanet if you're a Japanese investor, or like Dylan said, you don't. Like, he's like, and there's no middle ground. Like, either you really love them or you really don't love them. And that's where the volatility comes from. So anyway, the more volume, the more shares, the more volatility, all that helps the flywheel, because then they can get in with their moving stock warrants moving strike warrants and sell shares because they need the volatility. So the more volatile it gets, the more they can sell, the more Bitcoin they can buy faster. So that's
I
what we're
want
talking about. Yeah.
let's get into those warrants here in a second.
Oh yes.
Before we do, I wanted to, when we were looking at the different projections of acquisition for Bitcoin, I wanted to show the confluence. So these are two separate charts. The first one that we showed you guys was from Hayoko. And this chart here is showing Metaplanet here in the orange line, just stair stepping its way up. And you see that it has this, linear growth line that is basically sort of trending at. So it's just an interesting thing to look at the confluence from, chart to chart. If you look at the end of this chart, it ends here around October of 2025. And if you sort of guesstimate, on this log scale, this is from 10,000 to 100,000. It's somewhere near the middle, maybe a little bit over the middle. So let's just, be conservative and say 50,000 by October timeframe. So then if we look back at this tab here that we were looking at, just some interesting confluence right here. So right now we are in June, but if we go down to where October is, right here towards the end of October, you see is getting towards that $50,000 threshold. So I just wanted to note that for some of the viewers, as the confluence in both the charts almost align as far as the overall thesis of how quickly Metaplanet's flywheel is actually spinning. But let's pivot to this next topic, the moving strike warrants. Cris, I'll let you, talk through this and explain to the viewers exactly what this is and why this is important to understand.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between Metaplanet and Evo Fund is really crucial for you to understand, how they were able to acquire Bitcoin at the rate that they are acquiring it, and not only the rate now, but the rate they will acquire it. So they have this relationship with Evo, and this is a great diagram. I don't have the Twitter account that posted this. They did a great job with the relationship between the two. So the first part, it says, Evo Fund borrows shares from MMXX Ventures. And then what they're able to do is they're able to short the market, and then there's a spread between the two. And then Evo captures the spread, and that's what makes it profitable for them. And really, in the end, that's kind of what you need. That's kind of what you need to know with all this. But it has to do with borrowing shares off the market. And like in the second thing, it talks about selling in tranches into strong volume, which we talked about. If this is a very highly liquid tradable stock on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and so since the volume is so high, they can be active in this market so that Metaplanet can buy more Bitcoin through this process. So that's what keeps this flywheel going. Is they need volatility, they need volume over the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and then Evo takes the warrants from Metaplanet, and then with all the things that they do is they're able to capture the spread, and then they make money on the transactions essentially throughout this partnership. And so really that's what you need to know. But it is very important to understand like the dynamics of this. So that you know how they're able to buy Bitcoin. They're not just doing it out of thin air. They're doing it with a partnership with Evo. And what you'll also see is a lot of the filings that Evo is shorting Metaplanet. And so you see a lot of this, like, well, why is Evo, why are they shorting Metaplanet so much? And there's a lot of concern, even Japanese investors. There was an interview last week. A lot of the questions were, they were concerned with, a lot of the short interests that were out there. And if you don't understand the dynamic of what Evo's doing in the relationship with them and Metaplanet, then it does look kind of weird. It's like, why is Evo shorting them like this? But it's part of their process to help, the relationship for Metaplanet to be able to buy Bitcoin at a faster rate. But the last part, to kind of sum it up, says, Metaplanet uses the new capital from issuing the shares to Evo to then buy Bitcoin. And so that's what's going to increase their net asset value over time, because that's going to sit on the balance sheet. And then, to me, this is their golden goose right now. This is their focus, is this relationship with Evo. and the moving strike warrants. But what they're eventually going to do is they're going to continue to do this, potentially with the next plan once they go through this one. But they're also going to have preferred stocks. They're going to have preferred offerings on top of this ATM-like relationship, which is even more exciting because they're not going to only have to depend on this relationship, because this relationship with EVA is very important. And with the other thing with the warrants too, they can only sell at or above, at a premium versus it being at a discount. And it's the first time in the history of the Japanese markets that this has ever happened. Exactly. And so if you've noticed, what's interesting, there's a lot of the first time ever in Japanese market history, air quotes with them. Dylan keeps saying it over and over again with a lot of this stuff, because it's the first company to do any of this, and that's what's exciting. And so anytime a company's the first to do something, it's just very difficult to value it if you're a tech investor over the years. It's just hard. It's not easy. But if you get ahead of capital, if you get ahead of other investors, let's just be honest, then you reap the benefits that you were able to forward look and see in the future that, hey, this is, number one, is it's sustainable, and in my opinion, this is sustainable. And not only is it sustainable, they're going to add another layer and another phase into being able to acquire more Bitcoin in a very intelligent way. And then if you look up on their dashboard with this, this sounds confusing and everything else, and how much debt do they have? And they don't have a ton of debt. And now they just issued a bond issuance, but I've got it, if you're on Metaplanet .jp, but I've got it here. The debt outstanding is $292 million debt outstanding. And their net asset value of the Bitcoin is 1.1 billion. And so many companies, they're in the TradFi world, they're so over levered and so overvalued, and it kind of flips on the other head. And really, it was a lot more than this. Their BTC rating was like 20 something, but they're over collateralized as they are now. And then the more they're going to extinguish this debt over time too, and they're going to buy Bitcoin to put on the balance sheet. It drives down the debt and it drives up their credit rating and the collateralization, so that then once they issue the preferred stocks, they're going to be able to cover those coupons that they'll pay for the preferreds. Exactly. So all this, like, it's all tied together. And again, if you're kind of like, man, I got to put all these pieces together, go listen to Saylor's earnings call, the very last one, and he explains all of this. So his call for MSTR might as well have been a Metaplanet earnings call, because this is what they're going to do. And they've been very clear that that's their next phase. So people say, oh, there's so much debt. Well, no, there really isn't that much debt, and their goal is to not lever up too much. And Simon, I haven't talked a lot about Simon. Simon, he's a Harvard grad, applied mathematics. He was a derivatives trader for Goldman Sachs for years. He knows what he's doing. He's extremely articulate and has been in the capital markets for a very long time. So between him and Dylan and Shinpei and the rest of their team, they know what they're doing. And in the end, all these numbers are great and stuff. In the end, do you think in 5 years they will still be operating at a high level? It's something you have to ask yourself. You know what I'm saying? And if so, if you think so, they're probably going to have 300 to 400,000 Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's going to be over 1 million.
Yep. And that's a huge question, because other companies can understand the strategy that they're doing, but can anybody execute it? That's the other question you have to do when you're going down your investment thesis. You just mentioned Simon's background. He understands the capital markets on a whole another level in comparison to the average investor. And Dylan, for those that are in the Bitcoin space, his name speaks for itself. So them two at the helm, and along with their surrounding, other pieces of their team, it's sort of like a match made in heaven when it comes to executing this flawlessly. And just to give some little bit of context, when we just were showing the last slide with the moving strike warrants, so what they're doing is a creative dilution, and that, to the everyday person might sound a little bit topsy-turvy, or might be a little bit contradictory of how companies typically operate. But so what this means is like when a company issues more shares, so that's what they're doing with their 555 plan. It dilutes existing shareholders, but it uses the capital raised to buy assets that increase in value per share. In other words, the dilution decreases it. Each shareholder owns a small piece of the pie, but the pie gets much bigger because each slice is worth more, if that makes sense. Um, and that's what these Bitcoin treasury companies are doing, at a very high level. There's obviously bells and whistles to understand. But that is the playbook that's one aspect of the playbook to be able to, raise capital to buy more Bitcoin. So yeah, it's exciting time, man. It's exciting space that we're in right now. It's a frenzy. It's sometimes hard to keep up with all these companies that are popping up, right, that we mentioned earlier. Um, Before we close out, Chris, is there anything else that you feel like the viewers should know when it comes to exploring Metaplanet and strategies and companies of like, and also if they want to find out more about where you're talking about these things, where should they find you at?
Yeah, I try to do spaces a couple times a week. I think we're up to episode like 46, and we started. It was pretty periodic throughout that time, but we started in August of last year, mainly focusing on Bitcoin and microstrategy, and then kind of added Metaplanet to the mix the last 2 months. And it's a wide range of conversation, but for the most part, we stick to Bitcoin, MSTR, Metaplanet, and a little bit just in general the general treasury market. And I would go back to I'd go back to reading the Bitcoin standard. I would really focus on getting your foundation set of what Bitcoin is. I think you should send a Bitcoin transaction. I think that first time you send value that way, you kind of get a little depending on how much you send, you get a little feeling in your stomach when you send internet money across a connection. But
Right.
sending a transaction to yourself and just getting a feel for using using Bitcoin and using the Bitcoin network, I think it's important. Reading books like The Block Size War, Digital Gold, it's really good for the historical, like where has Bitcoin come from? Some of the people that have been involved over the years, but especially Block Size Wars, as far as knowing what Bitcoin had to go through to get to where it is today. Because Block Size War was kind of like the Civil War for Bitcoin. Big blockers versus small blockers, and what ended up happening at the end of that. So I think spending probably I would 50 to 100 hours of learning the historical stories behind Bitcoin and who's been behind it for all the different players over the years and how it's changed, and then I would also read there's several really good books. I've actually got a thread on Twitter that I need to pin to my profile. But there's several books. I think one of the best right now, and we've talked about it before on Spaces, but it's Mastering the Market Cycle from Howard Marks, and we're in this hype phase right now, and we don't know how long it's going to last. It could be 6 months, it could be 2 years, it could be a .com bubble run up, and then complete 99% crashes on some of these things because MNAVs go to 40. We don't know. Like nobody knows what's going to happen. We don't know if we're going to get a complete blow off mania like 2017. And but in the end, you have to identify. I would say in the end, you have to identify yourself as a trader or an investor, and then execute that way. Because if you're an investor, and again, if you're an investor, again, like we said at the very beginning, I think strategy would be the most valuable company in the world in the next 5 to 10 years. That's a pretty straight up this is what I think is going to happen within this time frame, and I really don't care what happens tomorrow. That's an investor mindset. Maybe you're Metaplanet, maybe you feel the same exact thing. Like you think they're going to be a top 5 valued company in the next 5 to 10 years, or maybe you don't. I mean, it depends on how you think they're going to operate, and do you trust that they're going to continue their trajectory over the next 5 years plus, or are you a trader? And you see this window for 6 months. And you have a plan, and more than likely you've traded cycles before. If you did 2017, 2013, maybe you've been in TradFi, you traded gold mining stocks back in 2016, or marijuana stocks in 2015. Okay, or not really a cycle, but the meme stocks in 2021. Like, I don't know if you've been through these things before and you overlay it on top of this now, you've probably got an advantage compared to someone that's never done this stuff before and they just see stuff going up and they're going to randomly click buttons. Let's just be honest. Like sitting at a poker table and you've played 2 million hands of poker, and then the other people are there just to have some fun. Who do you think long term is going to win? You know what I mean? So that's probably my biggest thing. So
Yeah, and just put context on what Cris is saying there. The largest company in the world right now is Microsoft. I think the valuation is around 3.5 trillion, give or take a few million dollars, between friends. That's a 35x as far as MicroStrategy's overall valuation, and that's just looking at the valuation, and it's going to be outperforming that. Now, think of this as well. Over the next 10 years, the M2 supply is going to continue to expand as well. So that 3.5 billion, sorry, too many zeros, trillion for a company like Microsoft is going to expand as well. So that just as likely could be 4, 5, $6 trillion 10 years from now or more. So that's what strategy is going to surpass in the years to come. So there's an opportunity there. Metaplanet is following strategy almost to a T as far as their overall Bitcoin treasury execution and strategy. It's an exciting time. Cris, we wanted to thank you for your time coming on the channel. Looking forward to doing this again and appreciate your time, man.
yeah, thank you.